Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, hui hui mai nei, tēnā tātou katoa. I bring apologies from our Vice-Chancellor and the PVC Humanities, both of whom are very sorry not to be able to join us in person for this evening, but I know one of them is watching online and they will both enjoy the evening later. I've had the tremendous pleasure of working very closely with Jenny in her role at Te Ao o Rongomarairoa, and it's an absolute honour to be asked to introduce her this evening. And it's also my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the University. Jenny's achievements are so vast that it would take me the entire evening to recount them all, which is not the point of being here. So here are just a few. Dr. Jenny Te Pā Daniel is Te Rarawa. She's a public theologian, scholar, experienced educator, but most importantly, she would say, an incurably devoted grandmother and great-grandmother. In Jenny's early career, she was a social worker, a gangs liaison expert advisor, and then later a tertiary student counsellor. Her first forays into tertiary education in the 1970s were challenging, but she was persuaded by her mentor and cousin, Muru Walters, to give it one more go, and she moved into the study of theology. Jenny completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Auckland in theology in 1991, and then her master's degree in education with honours in 1993. She went on to do a PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, which was awarded in 2001. Since then, in recognition of her outstanding commitment to global peace and justice through theological education, and for her distinguished service to the Anglican Communion, she has been awarded no fewer than 6 honorary doctorates from 2003 until most recently, 2020. So she is technically, I guess, Dr. Jenny Te Pā Daniel. In March 2010, she was awarded the prestigious Distinguished Alumni Award by the University of Auckland. In November 2010, she was further honoured internationally by being named Alumna of the Year by her PhD school in Berkeley, California. Jenny has a lengthy and impressive record of service within the Anglican Church at local, national and international levels. Until 2013, she was Ahorangi of Te Rau Kahikatea at the College of St John the Evangelist in Auckland. She taught at the college from 1992 and she was appointed Ahorangi in 1995, becoming, as we've heard, the first lay Indigenous woman to head an Anglican theological college anywhere in the Anglican Communion. She was installed as a lay canon at Auckland's Holy Trinity Cathedral and was a serving member of her General Synod for 15 years. She served almost 10 years as a member of the National Anglican Social Justice Commission and was founder and convener for the National Anglican Women's Studies Centre for 6 years. She has served the worldwide Anglican Communion in roles too numerous to list here, but including convener of the International Anglican Peace and Justice Network, a member of the Archbishop of Canterbury's International Anglican Theological Education Commission, a member of the Anglican Indigenous Network, and provincial link person to the Inter-Anglican Women's Network. She was a member of the 2003 Lambeth Commission. She served as moderator of a World Council of Churches working group from 2000 to 2006, and was a member of the Executive Committee for the South Pacific Association of Theological Colleges from 2009 to 2012. She serves as a member of the Postgraduate Academic Board of the Pacific Theological School in Suva, Fiji. Jenny has written extensively on gender justice, theological education, and race politics. She has taught theological and secular students in New Zealand and around the world. She has been a guest speaker, lecturer, facilitator, media commentator, preacher and panellist nationally and internationally on a whole range of political and theological issues, particularly those concerning social justice, Indigenous rights, feminist politics and theological education. She has served nationally as a member of the New Zealand Arts Council in recognition of her commitment to the arts, the National Interfaith Advisory Committee to the New Zealand Government on Religious Diversity, and she's currently co-chair of the National Religious Diversity Centre. But the achievement Jenny is most proud of is being a beloved nanny to 10 granddaughters, 5 grandsons, and 1 great-grandson. Together with her esteemed, wonderful husband, Roro, they are determined that each one of their grandchildren will know the world of opportunity arising for those who, like them, have been taught from a very young age to always give with faith-filled generosity to those in need and to always receive with grace and humility. Such, she believes, is the birthright of every child in the world. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Jenny Te Pā Daniel.
Taku mihi tuatahi, ki a koe te wahine, e tuku nei krakia mō tātou. Koutou rā, tēnā koutou te whānau whānui. Tēnā hoki koutou e pai nei I runga I te aroha, me ngā manaakitanga tō tātou matunu I te rangi. Mana tātou e arahi, mana tātou e ata whai I ngā wā katoa nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. E te atua e tō mātou matu I te rangi, e arahitia ai koe ngā tohunga o ona mata ki tau tama. Ka huri o mātou whakaro ki a rātou mā I tēnei rā. Ka maumahara mātou ki o rātou mahi whakamiharo. Āno te āhuareka a ngā waiwai I runga I ngā maunga o te kai kaui e te rongopai. E kauhau ana e te maunga rongo. Meinga te marama o tō rongopai kia te aho I roto I te ao katoa. Ka aru kia koropiku ai ngā tangata kia koe ngā wāhi katoa I runga I te ingo o te āriki o te rongomau. Āmeni. I thought this was a nice prayer to start with. God of peace and justice, in days gone by you have called many Indigenous leaders, men and women, to lead their people to struggle for justice by peaceful means. May we defend the rights of the powerless and build our communities on the basis of mutual care and love, in the name of God, who is perfect peace. Tuarua me mihi anō a hau ki ngā mana whenua, ngā kaitiaki pai o tēnei rohi o Otipoti taino atu ki ngā rohi katoa o Kaitahu whānui. Tuatoru, I want to, with respect, to acknowledge our hosts for this annual lecture, the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group, the Global Migrations Group and the Otago University Tertiary Chaplaincy Team. Yours is such a vitally important work in these increasingly uncertain and volatile times. Together, you represent the critical faith-based pillars necessary for social stability, for human flourishing, and a deep and enduring peace with justice for all. As we know, each one of the Abrahamic faiths implores us to act with and for and in peace. One of my Muslim friends shared with me a beautiful prayer from the Quran at 49:11, paraphrased in Māori and English. It reads, "Tūturu he tuakana, teina ngā tangata whakapono ki a rātou anō, nō reira me hauhau I te rongo ki wainganui o koutou tuakana teina, me te wehi ki a ala, ki a tohungia koutou." Translated, as I said, or paraphrased really, surely all believers are brothers, so make peace between one another and fear Allah that mercy may be shown to you. I was raised with what is known to Māori as Te Rawiri. This was the original Māori Anglican prayer book. Central to this precious taonga karakia are the Psalms, because these were among the first some of the first biblical texts to be translated into Māori, their significant and enduring influence was assured. When translated in the early 1830s, they assumed a tremendous depth of meaning because the indigenous language of the time was so powerfully evocative of the same imagery, symbolism, pain, and beauty inherent in the original lament-laden messages of the Psalms themselves. Remember, this is just preceding the times when Māori were to be systematically relieved of land, of language and resources. The times when diseases against which Māori had no immunity would soon begin to take their toll. As the full devastating impact of colonisation began to impact Māori, ironically and yet understandably, the Psalms especially provided boundless solace. They encouraged my ancestors to stay faithful and to believe that deliverance lay ultimately in their willingness to abide by the rules for right living, in obedience to God, irrespective of the suffering they were experiencing. I can still remember as a child listening to the elders chanting the Psalms, especially one such as 29:11. This is the one which reminds us all that the Lord blesses his people with peace. Kia hō mai e hua he kaha ki tāna hunga, he rongo mau tā ihua mana ki tāna hunga. And so it's completely unsurprising that as the years have gone by, Māori have continued to invoke the same faith-filled yearning for peace, and in our contemporary interfaith context, to see our contemporary greeting, Kia tau te rangi Mārie, as being akin to the greetings of our sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum and Shalom alaikum. Kia tau te rangi Mārie is a beautiful, gentle, spiritually enshrined sentiment. It's a sentiment which at once both implores and affirms the rightness of peace as the substantive basis of blessed and just relationships. In various religiously framed iterations, the sentiment itself is widely used throughout Aotearoa by most faith-based institutions. Kia tau te rangi Mārie is thus offered by Māori into the public discourses on how and why it is good and honourable for us all to carry within us this seed or kakano, which inclines us always toward essential human goodness. Every utterance of these words implies a simple and sincere, heartfelt yearning that God's peace will pervade our innermost impulses for human connection and thus will guide and inform our ways of interacting with one another, our ways of understanding one another, and perhaps most importantly, these words will and ought guide and inform our faith-filled instinct for ensuring justice for all. Because I grew up at a time in Aotearoa when the church and the marae were ascendant in Māori communities, then these words are ingrained in me, but more so their deep meaning and the faith-based praxis implicit in that meaning. It was in this way that my experience of whānau and community, and thus my formative instincts for all relationships, were premised on this simple little saying, Kia tau te rangi Mārie. It was only when as a child growing up in urban communities far removed from my whānau that I began to worry. I began to worry because for the first time I saw my mother, my stunningly beautiful, talented, articulate, kind-hearted Te Rarawa mother, being spoken to harshly, being publicly humiliated for no good reason, apart from being Māori. I saw her hold to her own mana, and I saw her tears, but she did not retort. And then it began to happen to me. The snide, racist remarks about my kumara appearance, my rubber lips, about how it must be the Pākehā half of me that was clever and that was good at sports, but neither was ever good enough for me to be chosen as a captain, and certainly never ever good enough for me to be considered for any leadership role in school. As a young teenager, I did not at that time apprehend my own mana, and initially at least I was too well-mannered to retort. Certainly, however, my earliest apprehensions of kia tau te rangi Māori e were fast receding. I was a more mature teenager through the 60s and early 70s, the years when Māori activism began to impact irrevocably upon this nation. Activism born of too many years of injustice, activism born of too many years of colonial oppression. I found my radical niche very early on, and somehow knowing intuitively that my faith nevertheless compelled me to stand up for redemptive justice. The Land March, the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal, Bastion Point, the Haka Party at Auckland University, Waitangi Day protests, the Māori language petition, my family home became a microcosm of the national struggle to reconcile the rising tensions between the descendants of those who had seized power and resources by force and legislative stealth, and those who had all along been willing to share both and to live peaceably alongside one another. Those who, through no fault of our own, were by then living the legacy of disenfranchisement from land, language, marae, and whānau. My Te Raroa mother was urging me on in my fledgling activist instincts. My Pākehā father was urging restraint, good manners, and the avoidance of conflict at all costs. Kia tau te rangi Māori e, my daughter, is what he would largely unsuccessfully urge upon me. I won't bore you by continuing the chronology of my life. Suffice to say, my scholarship and my professional career in the intervening years, I have always tried to be attentive and responsive to the moral and thus political dilemma invariably at the heart of racial, gender, economic injustice. I'm a completely inadvertent theologian. Never in my wildest imaginings did I ever consider I would ever be a student of theology, much less a teacher of it. In my early theological studies, however, I was so blessed to sit at the feet of those trained in the Mary Knoll tradition, and then later I was drawn to the teachings and writings of those staunch Latin American and black liberation theologians and activists, Jesuits especially. They gave me the theological language of social, political, and gender justice. They gave legitimacy to my protest instincts, and they were unequivocally encouraging and empowering and emphatic that together we have a job to do. Here in Aotearoa, also a very small number of Māori, as mainstream Christian church leaders, also subscribed to the faith-based urgings of those globally iconic, wonderfully, radically compassionate thinkers, teachers and activists, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Gustavo Gutierrez, Jesse Jackson. And it was these very few Māori clerics who ultimately aligned themselves with the original, the very courageous early Māori activist groups and individuals. In so doing, most of these leaders concurrently misaligned themselves with the leaders of their respective denominational churches, who did not approve of this unseemly mix of what they described as radical politics and faith. Clearly, those institutional leaders must in some way have held the same dim view of Jesus, who by all reputable accounts was a model, unapologetic radical activist, an unequivocal peace builder, but with an unerring eye for injustice. During my postgraduate studies, now as you've heard almost 30 years ago, I had moved into theological educational leadership. And initially I was so incredibly excited at the prospect of bringing my new learnings into what I later described as a 150-year-old, colonially inspired, patriarchally encrusted Anglican theological college, crying out for radical transformation. The institution was not in the least impressed with my stance, and ultimately, in spite of my best efforts to prove myself as a dedicated scholar, researcher, as an internationally reputable advocate and activist for peace with justice, as an active ecumenist and a very early advocate for interfaith studies, an enduring black mark was subsequently entered beside my name. Anyway, let me turn to 2003. 2003 is the year immediately prior to the inaugural Peace Lecture. That year, now 20 years ago, saw in Aotearoa the foreshore and seabed debacle unfold, which gave rise to unprecedented levels of public protest and led directly to the subsequent formation of the Māori Party. The Whale Rider was released to great public acclaim and an absolute dearth of critical analysis. Māori television was set to be launched. Ngāti Awa and Ngāti Tūwharetoa treaty claims were ostensibly settled. The government released a new Māori language strategy document entitled Te Rautaki Reo. It's an absolutely brilliant aspirational policy document which is lurching now somewhat precariously towards its projected fulfilment in 2028. And you will all recall, I'm sure, that Māori were declared to be just 16.5 of the newly recorded 4 million people in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2003. Also in 2003, about 5 times as many Māori as Pākehā were apprehended, prosecuted and convicted, and Māori accounted for 51% of male prison inmates and 58% of female prison inmates, well in excess of our 16.5% in the population. Furthermore, health, educational, socioeconomic and gendered inequities for Māori loomed large across every statistical indicator of life in Aotearoa. Surely there can be no question, therefore, that peace, by any cultural, moral, spiritual, indeed any intellectual definition, simply could not be seen writ large in the lives of Māori in 2003, and neither, I will argue, is it yet so in 2023. Worse, given the current increasingly virulent anti-Māori pre-election sentiments abroad in Aotearoa, and given some fairly recent, extraordinarily turbulent history in our nation, then the chances of us being able to say, let alone to feel, tau te rangi Māori, with confidence, let alone with compassion or aroha, is becoming more and more forlorn. It would not be an understatement to say that race politics, race baiting, anti-tiriti, anti-Māori leadership, authority, autonomy, are today intensifying in scale and in savagery. As we turn toward the general election, now just weeks away, I cannot overstate the levels of fear abroad that someday soon a random, unhinged actor will act on the racist rhetoric to deadly effect. Certainly, this is becoming an increasingly frightening time for those of us who are wahine and who are in any kind of leadership role, especially in the secular world. Look at how the Honourable Kiritapu Allen, an incredibly competent, fearless, visionary politician, was so cruelly and relentlessly vilified at a time of deep personal vulnerability. Look at how she was so readily publicly demonised, blatantly lied about after a no-harm car crash, and even today, no one has publicly retracted the widespread lie that the police used tracker dogs to find her after the accident. What about MP Marama Davidson? Have you seen the shocking video taken at the time she was deliberately struck on a pedestrian crossing? In broad daylight in Auckland's busy domain by one of Brian Tamaki's slavishly obedient foot soldiers. What about Moana Maniapoto, who makes the most stunning award-winning documentary programs? Have you ever had occasion to read the public comments posted after every single one of her measured, intelligent, fearless journalistic forays into the critical issues of our times? Issues which are arguably systemically and certainly attitudinally precluding any prospect of a just and enduring peace for Māori and thus more broadly for Aotearoa. What about her worship Mayor Tory Whānau? Oh, how certain media went into an absolute frenzy over her supposedly utterly egregious decision to bring her dog, her pet, her companion to work. Let alone how vilified she was for doing what I guarantee we've all had inadvertent occasion to do, to forget to pay for a restaurant meal. After either being distracted by the joy of breaking bread and drinking fine wine with good friends, or being confused about what the payment arrangement is among friends, or simply being too tired that we just forgot. Elizabeth Kerikeri, the Honourable Debbie Ngarewa Peka, Lady Tureiti Moxon, Nanaia Mahuta, outstanding leaders all, and all being targeted with hate speech, with violent, abusive messaging to do with their appearance, their pro-Māori obsessions, their so-called lack of credibility, and so on it goes, and all of it to the largest extent anonymous, of course. This is not measured, intelligent, dare I say, respectful disagreement. This is just outright cowardly and increasingly vicious, racist hatred. Now, I know there are some who will say, oh, well, this is all merely coincidental. The fact that all of these examples have Māori women at their centre is not in any way indicative of a concerted racist campaign to discredit, disparage, and ultimately to literally disempower Māori. Well, if that was all there is going on in Aotearoa, then maybe, just maybe, you could mount a successful argument along those lines. But of course, this is just a minuscule list of what is actually going on, and more broadly, and in my view, without sufficient legal restraint. I travel quite regularly, and so it is with deep sadness that I now regularly encounter Air New Zealand staff who tell me they are regularly verbally abused on flights and off for using te reo. And this has now gone beyond the very visible eye rolling during the safety video to actual confrontation, especially from passengers when disembarking. Just a week or so ago, I went searching in Auckland for some of that Whittaker's chocolate with the te reo Māori packaging. I wanted to give some as gifts for my overseas colleagues. I cannot repeat some of the responses I received when I asked in various supermarkets for the chocolate wrapper written in te reo. What about the Ku Klux Klan fancy dresses at the Kaimai School fundraiser just over a month ago? What about the jaw-dropping idiocy of a certain senior politician whose very recent announcement about Māori not being Indigenous was oh so gleefully seized upon by some in the mainstream media as being akin to a newfound gospel truth? What about the truly incendiary behaviour being undertaken and the vile propaganda being readily distributed around Aotearoa by Julian Batchelor and his anti-Tiriti, anti-co-governors, acolytes and cronies? What we have from this group are blatant, racist untruths being promulgated far and wide with potentially dangerous consequences. In case you haven't been blessed with an invitation to attend one of his roadshow hui, let me save you the bother. For here, according to Batchelor, is the definition you've all been waiting for. Co-governance is code for the takeover of New Zealand by tribal companies and their representatives, the end of democracy, the installation of apartheid and separatism into everyday life, eventually leading to a full-blown government by tribal rule. By and large, as people who live within, or at least who belong to communities of faith, I invite us, ask ourselves, does that definition sound right? Is this how you have experienced marae, wharewananga, Wharekarakia? Is this how you have experienced Māori as your friends, your colleagues, your whānau? Is this how you understand Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which provides, in my view, the original template for building a peaceful and just society? As Bishop Manu Bennett reminds us, Te Tiriti is a promise of two peoples to take the best possible care of each other. I want to echo his sentiments by adding, please don't worry if you don't know the clauses, the nuanced history, the legal status of Te Tiriti. Just know it was intended to provide a framework for peaceful, mutually agreed coexistence between tangata whenua and those who arrived later and who were also wanting to make a new home for themselves here in Aotearoa. Co-governance is thus a relational model premised on Te Tiriti principles of mutuality and interdependence. The only prerequisites for making the model work are kindness, compassion, fairness, humility, courage, ethical standards. What we see within those organisations and entities where co-governance is working well, and there are some, are easy, effective, mutually respectful, mutually enjoyable, equitable relationships. And why? Because co-governance is not about asset ownership, it's about the partnership relationship necessary for responsible governance or stewardship. So what does all of this have to do with us here and now? Well, you may recall earlier I did say the words, together we have a job to do. I haven't spoken as I have this evening for the sake of merely fulfilling a promise to contribute to the annual Peace Lecture, but rather by way of sharing with you that I've thought very deeply about what it is in Aotearoa today which is undermining, threatening, and precluding that deep inner peace I believe the faith-filled human heart so instinctively yearns for. I am Māori, I am a woman, and more importantly, as you've heard, I am the fiercely protective grandmother of 15 absolutely fabulous, talented, kind-hearted, generous-spirited young mokopuna, all of whom are Māori and most of whom are also Pasifika. I am determined they will not have their pathways in life restricted, threatened, or delimited by those who consider their humanity less worthy, less deserving, less capable. Clearly, given all I have just described and given the irrefutable evidence that racism in Aotearoa is right now being deliberately and very dangerously politically incited by a range of actors, then my mokopuna are potentially at risk, and I will not stand by idly and wait for them to be wounded by it. I have deliberately raised up the issues affecting Māori both historically and in our times, because from my read of the past 20 years of these lectures, there has never been a focus upon the myriad ways in which peace by any definition remains such an elusive possibility for the first people of this land. What saddens me more is that it has taken the heart and the voice of a wahine Māori to raise these up, especially when we collectively as peoples of faith, we know that when one among us is stumbling, then the collective remains unstable. For it occurs to me that if we are failing or even inadvertently choosing not to notice the plight of tangata whenua, then what about all those in our nation who are also right now profoundly vulnerable, including especially my Muslim sisters and brothers, my LGBTQ sisters and brothers, my migrant sisters and brothers, all of whom also have a human right, a legal right, or indeed a birthright to be in this land and to live lives characterised by dignity, freedom, and decency. My urging, therefore, is for us to mobilise ourselves with profound urgency, to identify, to strategise, and to act more closely together as peoples of faith to push back against the obvious sources of enduring harm to those already systemically disadvantaged. We have to get much smarter, much braver, more visible, and much, much more radical in our thinking and in our anti-racism being and doing. I do want to mention my admiration for the courage and determination of many of my Pākehā colleagues here at Otago University for their efforts in this regard. In the past few years of my tenure here, I have witnessed and experienced their allyship with deep admiration and with gratitude. They are the ones now challenging systemic racism, confronting structural injustice, advocating for the transformations needed to give full, authentic effect to policies and practices reflective of tiriti-based equity outcomes. They are the ones, therefore, also bearing the brunt of an endless barrage of criticism, vilification, threats to their professional status, and subsequently to their well-being. And so to all my professional colleagues, many of you now as treasured friends, I salute you for the example that you are setting among our peers in other universities across Aotearoa. Advocacy for the moral right has always been costly. We know that. It comes with our faith-based lifetime subscriptions. But I do think we have become unduly passive over time, for how else could we have even inadvertently overlooked the relentlessly elusive prospects of peace for tangata whenua here in Aotearoa? Now, I have not come with a 10-point plan for addressing the issues, for this is what we are required to work out together. In closing, however, what I do have are just a couple of urgings to help us begin that new journey together. Firstly, that becoming tiriti literate becomes mandatory for all within faith-based communities, because then we would all realise that Te Tiriti, like most legal treaties, is in fact the most effective organisational tool at our immediate disposal for achieving equity. We would soon realise, however, you cannot achieve equity-based justice by applying Te Tiriti within an existing inequitable system. First things first, institutional transformation thus becomes imperative. As the inimitable Tina Ngata reminds us, it is in its ubiquity that the power of racism rests. It is in the systems that refuse to accept its presence, even in the face of it, which allow racism to not only be maintained, but to proliferate. And further, it is the society and organisations which always point to others, but never to themselves, that fail to dismantle it and permit its presence as the default experience for everyone who isn't white. Secondly, that we take to heart the critical teachings left by Moana Jackson. Exemplary, gentle man, an outstanding tiriti exponent. Treaties, he reminded, are not settled, they are honoured. In so saying, he corrected the commonly asserted and utterly incorrect Crown mantra to do with full and final settlement. This is a phrase forced into all treaty negotiations, and all it does is fuel the racist assumption that somehow Māori are getting more than our financial share from the government coffers. Perhaps Moana's greatest gift and challenge, however, to tangata tiriti was to require honesty about the situation and to be willing to change. He made us understand that Māori being able to live as Māori in our own country is essential for peace and justice, and that tangata tiriti must face up to how they are preventing this from happening. I can picture Moana saying in that beautiful, gentle, deliberate way he spoke, that courage and bravery are just the deep breath taken before starting something difficult. And so my closing question to us all, are we as peoples of faith ready to take that deep breath together? Surely, as with Maya Angelou, we know that history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again. So, friends, I have a short poem from Maya Angelou for our collective consideration, and ultimately, I pray someday soon it will be for our speaking one to another. We, angels and mortals, believers and non-believers, look heavenward and speak the word aloud. Peace. We look at our world and we speak the word aloud. Peace. We look at each other, then into ourselves, and we say without shyness or apology or hesitation, peace, my brother. Peace, my sister. Peace, my soul. Kia ora tātou.